And welcome into the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today, I am super excited to have Audrey Burges on the show with me to talk about her brand new book, The Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone. What a fun title for a book, and what a great book it is. When I was trying to come up with kind of a title for this episode, and I had just read the book and I said writing romance with a touch of magic, and that was it's so much more than that though, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. So welcome to the show, Audrey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Audrey, we have been starting some shows off lately with a fun question to just kind of
Okay.
get the conversation started. And there's
Yeah.
one that I've really enjoyed asking people lately,
Okay.
and and we'll just see what you have to say about it. But is there a piece of writing advice that you have gotten over the years that either was such a fantastic piece of advice that you're super happy that you got it and you refer back to, or is there a piece of advice that is so horrible that you just shake your head at and think, why would anybody ever believe that?
Oh man, I could fill a whole day talking
I know,
about
right?
both of them. I should probably say I was raised by English teachers, so this is a rich vein of
Right.
lifetime, subject matter. I think probably the I guess I would characterize it as a bad piece of advice, to the extent that it is advice, is the just anything that is based on the idea that there are hard and fast rules with
Right.
writing. I think people get, especially when they're starting out, or if they've come from a particular kind of technical writing, or I'm a lawyer, that kind of thing. So, formulaic writing, very, very specific formulas. There's a real tendency to kind of, you never use passive voice, or you always, don't start a sentence with a preposition. Don't, all of the
Right.
kinds of things that are very, strunk and white, grammatical kind of rules. And I think that there's a lot of power in playing with those. I write a lot of, in addition to novels, I write a lot of short fiction and
Yeah.
humor and satire, and the short stuff. I think the closest kind of analog to anything like it is like poetry. I can't write poetry. I'm terrible at it. But the rules are kind of the same, where you kind of
Yeah.
have to be flexible, because you've got so little space to get to the meaning of what you're trying to get across.
Right.
So for me, anything that kind of is this rigid, like thou shalt not, I really shy away from. And there were rules that I used to consider. I remember, things that I think everybody has types of styles that they find distracting. So the thing that pops into my head as a former English major is I used to find Faulkner really distracting, the way he never used quotation marks. It was always dashes. And I thought, that's so distracting. I would hate doing that. And then I read The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake by Amy Bender, who does that same thing in a way that is utterly and totally consistent with the story. It's probably, I don't think I could have read it the same way if she'd done it the way you would have expected her to. So I think that you really have to give yourself permission to break the rules a little bit. It's important
Yeah.
to know what the rules are, I think, but I do think, anyone that insists, no, you never do it that way, or you always have to land your arc in this particular way, or I find that to be probably the worst advice.
You talked about the influence of your parents, and both of your parents were linguists. Is that right?
Yes. So when I was growing up, they were English teachers. We actually
Okay.
lived in this teeny tiny town on the edge of the Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona. So if you've read
Okay.
anything about Lake Powell that's drying out right now, that's where I grew up. And then
Okay.
they went to graduate school to become linguists when I was in junior high, and became linguists after that. Yeah.
Okay. Do you I guess let's see. How do I say this? You when did you know that you wanted to be a writer? Like, was this something that was always ingrained in you? And if so, if you kind of had this inkling from an early age, what were your parents' response to this? And did they feed the creative need? You know, if you think about it, it would be easy to think, well, they probably had an academic outlook on it, and you know that doesn't always feed the creative side. But what
Sure.
was it like in your family?
So my parents were always very encouraging, and I was one of those kids that just knew I always wanted to write. I always so
Right.
we in this teeny tiny town there was a kids corner in the local newspaper,
Yeah.
the Lake Powell Chronicle, I think. And so I submitted poetry. Um, Almost prescient. I think the first thing I published was "Can't You See I'm Trying," which was just a really,
Right.
kid kind of screed about no one, really not being treated well. Um, and then I wrote my first book. There, we had a book contest at my elementary school, and so in third grade, I wrote a book called "The Dragon Who Couldn't Fly," and I illustrated it. It was a chapter book. It was, each chapter was a page. And my mom actually put it in a binding, and she put my school picture in it and wrote an about the author section and made it into a real book. And she still has it. She still
Oh,
has,
that's so
we did
awesome.
that like every, I think third grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade, that was a competition. And they did that every time. So it was always something that they actively encouraged, which is not to say that because they were English teachers, is not to say that I would write something and I would take it to them and be like, "This is super, honey. This is the best thing ever. Don't change a thing." It was always like, "This is super. Now let's rip it back. It needs to be about 50% shorter. And here's how you do that." And so, but they were always hugely encouraging, and still are. I mean, and because I was raised by kind of language nerds, I've described to people that my parents were in graduate school when I was still in school, and my brothers were still in school. We were all in junior high and elementary, and we would have the side of our dining room just filled with this big piece of butcher paper that you'd slice off,
Yeah.
and they were using it to diagram sentences, really huge sentence trees all the way down from one side of the wall to the other. And so we were just a family of language nerds. We were, people who loved reading about the history of words and where they came from, and we loved puns. We were really insufferable to be around if you were not a language person. And
That
I
is
think all of that,
fantastic.
I think all of that just kind of made its way into who I became,
That's
for
so
better or for worse.
that is so fun. Um, Besides the minuscule mansion of Myra Malone, this is your first novel, is that right? But you
My
have
first
run
published one, yes.
okay, that's a great point. I'll come back to that in a second. But
Sure.
you've also written a ton of shorter fiction, satire, short stories. Um, Tell me about your love of satire because it seeps into this book so deeply. And then looking over some of the shorter works that you've done, I can tell this is a real passion.
Yeah.
Where did your love of satire come from?
So I always read it. I think probably the outlet that I read most, and all through college and high school and everything, like not high school, but college and law school. I was a diehard McSweeney's reader, and so when I wrote the first book, which I didn't wind up being successful, I wound up shelving it.
Yeah.
I was trying to, I had read about what you should do if you're trying to publish a book. And one of the tips was you start building a platform. And so I thought, okay, well, I read a lot of McSweeney's. I'll write something for McSweeney's, and I'll send
Yeah.
something to McSweeney's. And I did. And they have the kindest rejections in the business. And I know that over and over and over again, because I got a
Yeah.
lot of them to start. And but because I started publishing humor and kind of short, funny stories in various outlets, kind of started to build both that audience and
Mhm.
also just that voice, which had always kind of
Right.
been there. I always, even in dark things that I wrote, there was, kind of gallows humor, that kind of thing. So I'm one of those people that, if I'm standing in line at the grocery store, I'll find something funny to read, or I'll,
Yeah.
if I'm on my kids' floors at night, I'm scrolling through. And I really enjoy well done satire and humor generally. And of course, when you're a parent, you're often desperately looking for those moments of going, oh, I feel seen. This person has been through this
Yeah.
same thing I've been through. So I started writing those things. And it just kind of, it was originally, I'll do that for this book. And then it kind of became its own thing. And so because I did so much of it, by the time I started writing The Mansion, it really started to inflect kind of the way that I structured that book and the way that I kind of painted the characters and everything else. And I'm also the kind of person that I really enjoy writing that has even in I think that brings more depth to even a tragic storyline,
Yeah.
because there's no such thing. I mean, there are certainly such things as unmitigated tragedies, but there's, I think it ignores a lot of the richness of the human experience if you make it, there. Sometimes you've got to admit that even in that dark moment, somebody's going to crack a joke,
Yeah.
and so that does tend to make its way into my writing.
Well, and I tend to think, and we can debate on whether humor and satire are the same thing, if they're close cousins,
Right.
but a lot of times if you've got a story or a book that's really intense, one of the best ways to kind of let the reader off the hook a little bit and to
Mm-hmm.
let their adrenaline come down is to
Yeah.
offer a moment of levity,
Yeah.
something to let them feel safe again
Right.
is one way to put it, and then when you come back with a really tense scene, or maybe it's a thriller or a murder mystery or something, then when it becomes grave again, it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like it punches twice as hard because
Right.
you've given your reader a chance to catch their breath and,
Right.
kinda come down from it. By the same token, a lot of times, satire can tell the truth, in a more palatable way. If you can
Right.
make someone chuckle with it, a lot of times you can slide in things that are maybe difficult to swallow, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down,
Right.
it is one way
Exactly.
of looking at it. So, do you when you're writing satire,
Mhm.
um, are you thinking, about a point that you're wanting to drive home and thinking of new inroads to how what's your process for,
Yeah.
kind of seeing the truth that needs to come out, but maybe taking a different tact with it?
Yeah, so I would say it kind of depends on the structure of the piece that I'm planning to put together. And sometimes the piece doesn't know what structure it's going to have until I actually
Right.
start writing it. And I'm one of those writers that once I have a framework, like I have the spine of what I'm going to do, I can throw a skeleton on that thing really, really fast. I just
Yeah.
have to know what the framework is. And so with satire and with humor writing, sometimes, rarely, but sometimes I start with a title. A lot of satire writing and humor writing classes will advise people come up with the title first, because that's your
Right.
concept and that's your hook. I'm pretty bad at that. I've gotten better at it in certain respects, but I think one of the reasons that I don't do it as much as some other writers that I know who are really good at it, I don't write much timely humor. And by timely humor, I mean like the ripped from the headlines, like this just happened in the news 24 hours ago, and I'm writing this, kind of political satire and that kind of thing. I'm not good at that. I do write pieces fast sometimes, but it's very rare that I can write them that fast. And I also, usually if something in the news grabs me, I'm a little too close to it, and and that
Yeah.
rage comes through the piece in a
Yeah.
way that doesn't sound like me. And so a lot of what I write is what are called evergreen pieces that will last for a while. And then it really is just like I write a lot of list pieces that are comparisons. So like, I think the most recent one I wrote was, are you decorating for the holidays with children or starring in a heist movie? And it was kind of a juxtaposition of the nightmare of trying to put up Christmas lights with kids and dealing with the Christmas tree versus this kind of Ocean's 11 Elliot Gould character narrating. And those I do a lot. And it usually is in those situations, I'm thinking of the structure first. I'm thinking of, okay, I have this thing that is driving me personally crazy right now.
Right.
What's the most apparently dissimilar thing I could compare it to that actually has a lot in common with it? And so in those situations, I'm usually thinking of comparison. When I'm writing a more narrative piece, I'm usually starting from the concept of what kind of strikes me as funniest. And I've taught a couple classes on revising humor, and one of the things that has kind of interested me is that depending on how you trained as a writer or where you did most of your writing before you started writing satire, whatever your funniest line is will be in a different place. So for example, most of the writing that I've done has been as a lawyer before I started writing creatively. And as a lawyer, you make the point first and then you support everything.
Right.
When you're an English major, when you're writing a academic analysis or something like that, you make all your points first because you're building to your point and then you put your point at the end. If you're a technical writer, you're usually doing point, justification, point, justification, point. And so where your strongest line is, which actually usually needs to be your first line or even your title, will often be drawn from where your experience is from structuring writing. And so I have gotten pretty good at identifying fairly early on in a draft where the strongest idea is coming from, and I let that guide the rest of the piece. And I also have little things that I'll call back to from earlier pieces. And the last few pieces I've written, I've had this little girl named Persimmon who keeps popping back up. She and her mom are really insufferable, and they're just fun kind of Easter eggs for me that I put in from time to time. So it really just depends on how what message it is that I want to get across, and what makes me laugh. And it usually starts, especially when it's a parenting piece, it usually starts from whatever has frustrated me most in the past week.
Is your creative process different? It's obviously different, but how is it different when you're writing a short piece or maybe a piece of short fiction versus a satirical piece versus a long form novel? Do you approach those three projects in different ways? Do you come to the page the same with them? And then I guess what I'm asking is, does the idea dictate the form, or are there just ideas and then you need to write to kind of figure out where this thing lives?
So it's kind of a combination of both. I actually have joked that I seem to have this no man's land between about 800 words and 80,000 words. I don't have anything in between there. I always wind up, And so, when I see these, short story contests and they're like, send us your best 4,000 word piece. And I'm like, I don't have that.
All or nothing.
And I've got novels and I don't have anything. And
I think they call that famine or feast.
Right. Exactly. You're either going to get a few words or a whole lot of them.
Right.
And so a lot of times I think it's probably, I don't think I've had the experience yet, given the breadth of that no man's land. I don't think I've had the experience yet where I start writing a story and I'm like, oh no, wait, this isn't a flash story. This is a novel. Especially because the arc is so much bigger. So when I have that, 700, 800 words to play with, I know where I need to land. And I start planning that out before I start writing. With novels, I kind of go back and forth. So I have books. Mansion was a really fast writing experience. I wrote it really, really quickly. And that's because once I realized what it was, which was about 1,200 words in, I started writing it as a romantic comedy. That was my initial intent. And then I very quickly learned that wasn't what it was going to be. about 2 chapters, second or third chapter, when Myra's, a little girl, and she's putting the dollhouse in the attic. She sees a reflection of her own eye, and it winks at her. And she doesn't know how to wink. That sentence kind of popped into my head, fully formed. And when that happened, I knew immediately what had happened. And then it was just a question of kind of stepping back from that to figure out how to get to where I knew I was going to go. But I've had the book that's coming out after. The first chapter of it is in the back of the mansion. It's called A House Like an Accordion. That did not come out that way. So I went into it kind of similarly with a different idea of where it was going to be, and got about halfway through it and thought, this is going a different direction than the original idea I had is not true to how these characters are starting to interact. And so I wound up having to go back and kind of tease things out a little bit and restructure and figure out how I was going to put that together. And so it really, I'm not a plotter, so I'm not good at outlining. I do, especially after the first couple of books, I started trying to at least write the synopsis first, mostly because I hate it so much. But also because then it's done and I give myself permission to deviate, and I always deviate, but I at least have a starting point. And then I will often, if I hit a snag when I'm otherwise, clicking along pretty well, I'll put a bracket that says something like, insert explanation for this here, or that kind of thing. And I'll close the bracket and then go to the next idea I have, and then go back and fill in the blanks later. There's only really, I think there's been one book that I've written so far that really was a very linear experience from beginning to end. And it was the book I had the idea for while I was writing House Like an Accordion. And I made myself wait until I finished House Like an Accordion, because I knew if I went for the bright and shiny new idea, I would not finish the idea that was giving me more trouble. So by the time I got to it, it came out just in kind of just one linear piece. But that was really probably the only time that happened. So that was a long answer to a short question.
No, that's fine. I love books like this, and I love the idea of a story that is rooted and grounded in what feels like just could be normal everyday life,
Yeah.
and then weird, odd things
Yeah.
start happening, and kind of like if there's a veil between this life and whatever else
Right.
is there, like it's just you find places where it's a little thinner, and
Right.
you can see the other, world or
Exactly.
whatever. I love stories like that. I
Me
love
too.
feeling that the world is tangible. Like this is a
Yes.
world I could live in, but strange things can happen.
Yeah.
I love that, and to me, this very much felt like a Neil Gaiman book, or like he's a
Thank you.
master of just kind of blending the mundane with the fantastical in
Yeah.
little subtle ways, in a lot of ways, and I just love that.
Thank you.
What are your ideas? Like, before you started writing this book, was that something you were interested in? Did those types of stories intrigue
Oh
you?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
I always have. And of course I grew up reading, everything I could get my hands on in terms of, read all the Tolkien, read all Lion Witch of the Wardrobe, every possible foundation, A Wrinkle in Time, every possible fantastical kind of book you could think of. And then when I got older, I read a lot of it. Loved Neil Gaiman, loved Sarah Addison Allen, loved Amy Bender. And I really, for me, the thing that I really love about that kind of near magic, right? The real world, but just little bits of magic, is that it's not just that it that there's that sense of like the world's kind of thinning in between. This is going to sound weird. It also makes this world more magical for me, because there are moments that I'll notice something and I'll be like, oh my God, that's this, I'll give you a really weird example. I haven't told anybody this. So when I was writing, I had sold the mansion. We'd gone through edits. I was working with a museum.
Okay.
That is an old, probably 1840s house. And I had never actually toured the house myself. So I got taken on this tour, and I went up to this upstairs bedroom, and it had a fireplace, and it was a marble fireplace. And in front of the fireplace were these two kind of Florentine tapestry chairs. And next to one of the chairs was a dusty rose pink hat box. And right outside in the hallway was a huge chifforobe that was so huge that they'd had to cut into the floorboards to make fit. And it was literally the pieces. It was like, I took pictures of them all and I sent them to my agent. I said, I can't believe this. This room really exists. Like these pieces really exist. And so another example is that when I wrote the minuscule mansion, I was a person that was always fascinated with miniatures. I loved miniatures, but I didn't have a dollhouse. I didn't have miniatures growing up. I was just the kind of person that if I saw them in museums or anything like that, I had to be dragged away from them. And so I started following them a lot more after I wrote the book. And a friend of mine who was reading an early draft said, this really reminds me of this museum that my dad used to take me to when I was a kid that had this lady made these miniature rooms, and it's called the Thorn Galleries. I've never heard of these before. And it's in Chicago, and it's these little period miniature rooms. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was poring over the pictures and just fascinated. But one of the things that fascinated me about it was that the woman who made them was very insistent that they were not for dolls. People would ask her to put dolls in these rooms, and she would say, no, that's not what this is. These are miniature rooms. They are not intended for dolls. And she sounded like Myra. I was like, oh my God, that's really, so those kinds of, I think I'm the kind of person that I'm primed to notice details. I collect them. I put them in my notes app. I think about them. Weird little facts of the way animals interact or things like that. And so because I'm always noticing those anyway, I tend to, my husband teases me because I'll always say, I don't believe in science, but he'll be like, you absolutely freaking believe in science. You say you don't believe in science, and you totally believe in science. So I do think that it kind of increases the magic.
Yeah.
That I'm primed to notice. Yeah.
100%. And do you feel like that being the kind of person that notices those little details as a writer, does that skill or quirk or whatever you want to, call it, do you think that helps?
Yeah.
Because like, for instance, if you're reading a book and you come away with this feeling that, man, the world building was just magical and this, I felt so immersed. And then you go back and you kind of look at it and you think, well, it's not that I was overwhelmed with details about the world. It's just the details that the writer gave me were so important that, it's like, it's not that you need to describe every tapestry that you come in contact with. It's you need to find the things that stand out. And
yes. I'm sorry. I'm like
that skill.
Oh yes. No. That is exactly right. And actually, it's really funny you should say that because like one of the things that I think does that really well is Erin Morgenstern's The Night Circus.
Yes.
When she's describing the thing that I always think about are the circus exhibits and the clocks. And if you go back to that book, you will actually notice, because of course I reread it constantly. She doesn't actually go into the degree of detail that you have in your head. You will realize when you look at it, you're like, I filled this in my head. Exactly. And when I was first querying the mansion, I had a couple of agents say, I want more detail about what the house actually looks like and what it, and I didn't do that on purpose. I wanted everybody to kind of have their own version of what this, and that's what I've actually really loved. And my UK publisher, Pan Macmillan, Gillian Green, my editor, sent me pictures of what she had kind of pictured the mansion to look like, because they were commissioning a miniaturist to make furniture from the house for the cover. And when they were doing that, just hearing, like, she's like, I always kind of pictured it this way, and it had the gingerbread trim, and everybody just has their own image of what this place looks like, what it sounds like when the music is playing with. And I love that. I think Myra would love that there's not just one world, there's everybody's version of what this world is like. And that's just a hugely magical experience for me as a reader. I just absolutely love realizing the craftsmanship that goes into giving me just enough to work with to
Right.
kind of hang my own details on it. I feel the same way about like when somebody will ask me like, if it was the movie, you know, who would you cast? And I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, kind of have that idea. But on the other hand, when I read someone say that about a book that I've loved, I'm always like, no, that's not who that is. Now I'm going to picture
Right.
that when I read it next time. So, you know, I do, I think that's something Neil Gaiman does really well.
Yeah.
Something that Amy Bender does really well. And I don't know if it's something that I even necessarily did consciously or that they did consciously, but for me, it's you have to give people just enough to play with because that's what
Yeah.
makes it theirs. Another example is the Golem and the Ginny is another good
Yeah.
example to me of that, where it's just the way they describe, the way Helene Wecker describes making the figurines, the working with gold and everything like that. I just love that.
You mentioned earlier The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia Chronicles, and also Lord of the Rings. And
Yeah.
if we think about that, Lord of the Rings is a completely different fantasy world with
Yes.
Middle Earth, and we have elves and orcs and hobbits and magic. And then we have the world of Narnia and that is a portal fantasy. It's another
Right.
place that exists that you can go to,
Right.
and we have these magical creatures, and the whole world is built on magic, and it's a completely immersive experience. You leave here and go to this fantasy world, you know. Whereas your book is, like we mentioned, it is our world with some magic sprinkled,
Right.
for lack of a better word. How do you decide what the level of magical immersion is? And is this do you like create fantasy rules for your world, and can anyone tap into this? Is it just this special person that can, like, do you wrestle with the rules of it as you're writing?
So yes, I do, and
Okay.
that's and all of the novels that I write have that kind of thread of magic, and figuring out the rules of how things work is important to me. Because I don't like that experience as a reader that when I finish a book and I'm like, oh, I really liked that, and then an hour later I'm like, wait a second, how does that work? And I think sometimes people are going to have that experience no matter what you do, because they're going to find, you know, holes in what you constructed no matter what.
Sure.
And the other balance is, and this is tricky with kind of near reality, is if you go too far into those details, you do wind up with a Lord of the Rings, right? There's no way to kind of go too far into the structure of how something works without turning into something else, which is a long-winded way of saying there's a sequel to The Mansion. It goes into that a little more. But that is something that I do kind of, it's one of those things I think about, like when I'm on a long drive or when I'm staring at my ceiling at night or something like that, where I'm kind of thinking through. I mutter under my breath a lot when I'm kind of planning those things out, which my husband and kids kind of tease me about. Like when the first book that I wrote actually had a forest fire in it, and my husband and I were driving to work one day, and he heard me kind of muttering, "How many have to die?" 9, I think 9 have to die. That'll be, and he's like, if anyone didn't know that you were a writer overhearing this. So I have those kinds of things that I'm kind of working through in my head the whole time, just to kind of figure out the structure of how that magic works. And sometimes I have to revisit that. I'll go, when I go back through what I've put together, I go, oh no, that's not consistent, or it's not consistent with what I think I'm going to do with this story next, or that kind of thing. So it's kind of a balance, because again, the other thing you have to balance is that same factor of trying to keep a little bit of mystery, trying to let the reader fill in some of the blanks,
Right.
that kind of thing.
So I have a question that I love to ask people, because I've done almost 1,300 author interviews, and everybody's answer is different. But in your creative life, there's a moment of creation where at one moment the minuscule mansion of Myra Malone does not exist in any form or fashion. And then either a character walks onto the stage of your mind, or you start playing the what if game. Maybe you see something and it just, kind of starts the process, or you read a news article, and then characters tend to, move
Right.
into your brain, and well, who are these people and what are they up to? And
Yeah.
and then at some point the book does exist, and then it's your job as a writer to dig that thing out of the ground, dust it off, polish it up,
No
and
pressure.
and yeah, and to bring the story to life. But what is that? Is there a typical moment of creation for you? Is it all different? Or is there like a common flash that happens with you when this thing is birthed?
Been different with every book. And I will tell you the weird thing about The Mansion, because it is the only time that I've written anything, not just a novel, but satire, short story, anything, that the title came to me first. I usually really, really struggle with titles. But when I was talking to some friends of mine, we all met when I was working on that first book. We were all trying to get into pitch wars together. We became friends over Twitter many years ago, and I was chatting with them about the fact that I was getting good feedback on that first book, but it was much darker, and people were saying it's not consistent with the voice that you've built. We're not quite sure how we'd commission, how we'd kind of position this in the market. And so I was like, I need to write something like lighthearted. And I read a lot of lighthearted stuff. I should be able to do this. And I was just kind of thinking about ideas. And I followed a lot of people. Actually, I know a lot of writers that make miniatures, that buy kits or they modify kits, and they make. And because of algorithms, I was getting fed more and more of those when I was spending time on social media during the pandemic. And so I had an idea. I'm like, that's what I'll do. I'll have a miniaturist. Maybe she sells these kits or, something, but this is what she does. And she kind of sticks to herself, and she's kind of, introverted, and this, it goes on the internet and goes viral, and it's going to be a meet cute and be a love story.
Yeah.
And when I was like, well, what's something I could do with that? The title came to me immediately. And I immediately sent to my friends. I'm like, The Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone. Introverted 30-something, stays at home with her miniatures, goes viral, meets a guy, turns into a thing. And they're like, that sounds funny. You should start writing that. And so I did. And then like 50,000 words came out in a few weeks. It just kind of went all at once. But it wasn't that, it wound up I did not go in planning for it to be magical. That happened with that wink of the eye. I did not go in planning for it to be a dual timeline or multi-timeline or multi-perspective novel. It opened originally with that first conversation between Gwen and Myra. That was originally the opening of the book.
Really?
Yes. And Gwen was there right away. She was the stronger speaker, and she just and when I first started writing them, I hadn't aged them yet. I thought that they were going to be in their 30s, but at first, the first version of that conversation, she really struck me as somebody older. Like she struck me as like this overbearing older neighbor who would come over. But then I realized she wasn't. The way they were bantering together, I'm like, no, they've known each other since they were kids. But yeah, it came to me as the title first. And then as I started writing and those personalities started interacting and the world kind of started, I think it would have been a magical story. I don't know why I didn't think of that from the beginning, because to me, miniatures are inherently magical. They're just, you can't have something that small and that detailed and with that much love put into it on that scale. And not, it seems magical. It doesn't seem
for it not to absorb something.
Yeah. It just doesn't seem. I actually had this, like, I started following a lot of miniatures. One thing that went viral probably a few months ago now were these miniatures. Did you see the miniatures and walnut shells by any chance? Did you see that video?
Yes.
The little switches, the little lights and everything. Well, of course I saw that and I'm like, oh, okay. Well, this clearly I have to find one of these. So I found one, but I didn't find it. I was looking for a library and I went on Etsy, and just right after I searched, I found this artist in Sri Lanka, and she made this little he just fell out. It's Van Gogh's Bedroom at Arles. It has this little hand-carved cherry tree with little hand-carved blossoms. It has a little chair. It has all his little pieces, his self-portrait, Starry, Starry Night, a mirror, all sorts of stuff. And I saw this and I went, oh my God. And I had just published a satire piece about Van Gogh. And I went, well, clearly, right. I don't believe in signs, right?
Of course not. But
totally don't believe in signs. And
but there just happens to be one.
Right, it just happens to be. And so, and she and I wound up corresponding online. She was just lovely. She went and read the piece and that kind of thing. But I that's magical, right? Like, you have this weird coincidence. And one of the other examples, like the Vienna sausages in the book, that's a real story. My grandfather really did that when I was a kid. And it's still a joke in my house that whenever I find there are random times that when my husband and I were together for a while and hoping to have a child, I pulled over my car one day and I opened up the door, and there, sitting on the sidewalk, just as if I left it there, was this can of random Vienna sausages. And I called my husband and I said, we're going to have a kid. And he's like, what?
I don't believe in signs.
I don't believe in signs. I'm like, Granddad left me for some Vienna sausages. And he's like, I love you. But you I was right. So
best thing ever.
So there's just, again, these are details that I collect. So yeah, I think it would have been I don't think I could have written about miniatures, especially the way I react to them, and not have a little bit of that magic weave its way through.
I love that so much. Oh man, you mentioned the book that you wrote that did not publish, and of all of the author interviews that I've done, I think that is a very common story. Most people have a desk drawer novel or a trunk novel, as we used to call them. Is there any hope that manuscript will see the light of day? Do you have any desire to rewrite it, or have you, like, looking back from where you are now, then looking back on that book, can you tell what it was about it that just didn't work, or was it a story that was just not of the present time?
It was a mystery, and it was set in the foster care system. And it included the foster care system, a deadly forest fire, orphans, and the heroin epidemic. So, which is a nice way of saying it was a lot. And it was informed by some of the work I'd done professionally, but it was also a kind of a gallows humor. It had a lot of humor in it because that's the way I write anyway. And I do think a lot of people who read it really loved it. I think there's some things I could do to make it better, but I wrote it and half of a sequel after it that kind of was almost going to be like a mystery series. And I would love to think that I could find a home for it someday, maybe even under a pseudonym, because it is kind of there are elements of it that I even thought to myself, I'm like, maybe I could make it more magical. It could have some connections to it, but I also, in light of some of its subject matter, I don't necessarily want to lighten that too much and somehow
I understand
make it less serious, So, so I haven't really decided, but my children and my husband, for my birthday, the year before I wrote Mansion. Actually, my husband looked up a class online for how to bind books, and he bought supplies. He did this by surprise. And my daughter designed a cover for it.
Oh, wow.
And they bound the book and printed it out as if it was going to be bound the book, put my daughter's cover on the front, and she wrote #1 bestseller at the bottom with the R and the E reversed. And so I still have that. And she still asks from time to time, is it going to be a real book? And I'm like, well, it is a real book. And she's like, it's not a real book. So maybe someday. Yeah.
I love that. The Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone is out now, available everywhere. It came out last week or the week before. We couldn't figure out before we started
It was last week.
recording, but it's out now. You can go to your bookstore and you can grab it off the shelf. With your parents, your familial, your parental family, however you say that, with the language jokes and stuff that you talked about, was the alliterative title of this book, was that kind of a nod and a wink to your family history?
I think a little bit. I think it probably was more English major nerd. And I always loved alliteration. I always loved assonance. They appear a bunch in poetry, and like I said, since I'm so terrible at writing it, I'm better at pulling elements of it into other things. And also other magic. Someone else who interviewed me told me that there's a series of books, middle grade books, that are set in the Thorn rooms, those miniature rooms that I told you about. And when I went and looked up the author, I think her name was like Madeline Malone or something like that. I'm like, so, but the M's were just, I didn't want miniature. I wanted a different word. Minuscule was the first one that came to mind. And then that just kind of informed the rest of the title.
Well, I absolutely love it. And I think one of the highest compliments that you can pay an author is that when you finish the book, the characters and the story are still there, and you kind of walk around still thinking about the world and the way things have worked and how the characters affected you. And I'm happy to know that there will be some follow-up in this world and with the story. So that makes me very happy. We're going to put links in the show notes to where you can go grab the Minuscule Mansion of Myra Malone. Audrey, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you are up to, is there a place online where they can find you and connect with you?
Sure. So my website is audreyburgess.com, all one word and with just one S. And then my on Twitter, which is probably where I'm most active, I'm at Audrey_Burgess, so Burges. And on Instagram, where I'm trying to get better, I'm at Audrey Burgess, all one word, and Facebook is A Burgess Writes.
Excellent. We'll link all that up to make it easy for folks to find you. Audrey, this has been so much fun chatting. Please come back and let's do this again.
I'd love to. I thank you so much for having me. It was so fun talking to you.